She had flour on her hands the morning she heard the news. Judith Crane was elbow-deep in the second proving of her morning loaves when old Mrs. Pellet pushed through the bakery door, shaking ice from her bonnet and carrying gossip like a torch. "The Hawthorne woman won't last a week," that's what she said. Said it the way people say things they find secretly satisfying. A great man humbled, a fearsome family finally breakable. Everyone in Iron Ridge knew about Edward Hawthorne. Everyone had read the notice. Half the town had laughed at it. The other half had sent their daughters anyway, returning them home tearful and wind-chapped and furious. Silk and softness need not apply, as if a wife were a work mule, as if tenderness were a defect. Judith had not laughed. She had stood at the corner of the store that morning 3 weeks ago, reading the notice twice, her broad hands folded in front of her apron. She had thought only of Esther, of a winter 15 years past, of a woman who had pressed a small lavender handkerchief into a weeping girl's palm and said quietly, "You are more than they see." Judith wiped the flour from her fingers and began to pack her grandmother's satchel. The satchel was old leather, cracked at the seams and dark with years of handling. Her grandmother had carried it on mountain trails before Judith was born, before Iron Ridge was anything more than a surveyor's mark on a government map. Inside it now, dried yarrow, a tin of rendered tallow infused with pine resin, a folded cloth of black cohosh root, and at the very bottom, wrapped in wax paper and tied with twine, a pouch of the compound the old woman had called root fire. Judith had never used it on a person. She had only watched, once, as a child, her grandmother draw poison from a man's infected leg over the course of a single terrible night. The man had screamed. Then, by morning, he had asked for broth. She did not tell anyone where she was going. There was no one to tell, not really. The girls she had grown up with had married and moved to the warmer valleys below. The bakery owner, Mr. Hess, would find the morning loaves already shaped and rising under cloth when he arrived. She left no note. People in Iron Ridge did not expect explanations from Judith Crane. They expected bread and quiet, and the particular invisibility of a woman who had learned early that taking up less space was the price of being left in peace. Outside, the sky was the color of an old bruise. The clouds had been building since noon the day before, heavy and greenish at the belly, the kind that old-timers read like scripture. Snow before nightfall, they would say. Real snow, the kind that closes roads. Judith looked up at those clouds for a long moment. Then she went to the livery and paid 2 weeks' wages to rent the largest draft horse they had, a roan gelding named Cornet, broad as a dining table and utterly indifferent to weather. She tied the satchel to the pommel, checked the cinch twice, and mounted with the practiced economy of a woman who had never had the luxury of being dainty. The Hawthorne estate sat 4 miles up the eastern ridge, past the tree line, past the place where the road stopped being a road and became a suggestion. Edward Hawthorne had built it there deliberately, people said, high enough that visitors had to want to arrive, high enough that the week turned back. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Edward Hawthorne, 34 years old and built like something the mountain had assembled for its own purposes. A man who had once carried a felled elk 3 miles on his back because his horse had gone lame, arriving home with the carcass and not a word of complaint. A man who had, by every account, looked at the parade of women who answered his notice, seamstresses, school teachers, a banker's daughter from Cartwell who had arrived in a covered carriage with a leather trunk, and dismissed each one with the same flat, impersonal verdict: not strong enough. The banker's daughter had reportedly repped all the way back down the mountain. Edward had reportedly returned to splitting wood before her carriage rounded the first bend. Judith was not a banker's daughter. She was not a seamstress or a school teacher, or anything the town of Iron Ridge considered a suitable subject for male attention. She was large and plain and good with her hands, and she had long ago made a private peace with the fact that the world intended to overlook her. She had decided, somewhere in her 20s, that being overlooked was not the same as being powerless. Cornet moved steadily upward through the first flurry of flakes as the light began to fail, his massive hooves punching clean holes in the gathering snow. Judith kept her chin down and her eyes on the trail, and thought about Esther Hawthorne's hands, how they had felt, warm and certain, pressing that small square of lavender cloth into a 12-year-old girl's fist. You are more than they see. One of them, at least, had meant it. The snow thickened. Judith rode on. The snow had not always been her enemy. There had been a winter, when Judith was 12, when it had felt like mercy. The year her mother's lungs finally surrendered to the damp of their low-lying cabin. The year the town of Iron Ridge had looked at a wide-eyed, heavy-set girl with no father on record and decided, collectively and without much deliberation, what her life would amount to. Not cruelty, exactly, just the particular arithmetic of small towns. Some people were assets and some were liabilities, and the sooner everyone understood which column they occupied, the smoother things ran. Judith had understood by 13. She had gone to work at Hess's bakery at 14, first sweeping, then mixing, then, because her hands had a feel for dough that old Hess openly admitted he had never seen in 30 years of baking, eventually running the morning production entirely on her own. She arrived before the sun, she left after the last loaves cooled. She was, by any practical measure, the reason the bakery functioned, though the sign above the door still read Hess and Sons, and the wages still reflected the assumption that gratitude was its own form of compensation. She did not complain. Complaining required an audience willing to listen, and Judith had learned to be economical with her energy. What the town of Iron Ridge did not know, what she had never offered them because they had never thought to ask, was what else she carried. The knowledge had come from her grandmother, May Crane, who had lived alone on the upper eastern slope for 40 years and was regarded by most of Iron Ridge with the particular mixture of dismissal and superstition that small communities reserve for old women who don't need them. May had learned her medicine from her own mother, who had learned it from hers, a lineage of women who had survived in landscapes that didn't forgive mistakes by developing an intimate empirical understanding of what grew in the earth and what it could do. Judith had spent every summer of her childhood on that slope. While other girls were learning embroidery and social navigation, she was learning which bark reduced fever and which caused it, how to pack a wound with yarrow to slow bleeding, how to read infection by color and smell, how to render fat and resin into a drawing poultice that could pull corruption from deep tissue over the slow course of a night. May had taught her the way a craftsman teaches an apprentice, not gently and not with much praise, but with the absolute seriousness of someone passing on something that mattered. The body wants to heal, her grandmother had told her, more than once, stirring something dark and pungent over the fire with a stick she kept for that purpose alone. Your job is only to stop interfering with it, remove what's killing it, step back, wait. Judith was 17 when May died. She had packed the old woman's satchel herself, sorted the dried stores into labeled tins, folded the handwritten pages of notes into the front pocket, and carried the whole of it down the mountain on her back. She had stored it under her cot at the boarding house where she lived, and later under the narrow bed in the single room she rented above the tanner's shop, and she had not spoken of it to anyone. It was not a secret she protected out of fear. It was a secret she protected out of accuracy. Iron Ridge would not have known what to do with the information. It would have sat wrong with them, a woman like her, claiming knowledge like that. They would have found it presumptuous. They would have found it strange. And so she had kept it the way she kept most things of value, close and quiet, and entirely her own. Cornay crested a rise, and the Hawthorne estate came into view, below a shelf of dark pine, lamplight burning in 2 upstairs windows against the thickening dark. Judith pressed her heels gently into Cornay's flanks and rode toward the light. The gate was iron, which she had expected, and open, which she had not. It hung at a slight angle, one hinge older than the other, the kind of detail that spoke not of neglect, but of a man who lived alone and saw no need to perform order for an audience that never came. Beyond it, a stone path cut through a yard that was functional and severe, a woodpile stacked with mathematical precision along the left wall, a water trough frozen at the edges, a lean-to sheltering what looked like 2 horses and a mule. No ornament, no concession to softness anywhere. Judith dismounted and led Cornet through the gate, looping his reins around the post of the lean-to and pressing her hand briefly against his broad neck. He exhaled, warm breath clouding in the dark, and she felt the familiar solidity of him settle something in her chest. She turned toward the house. It was larger than it appeared from the ridge. 2 full stories of squared timber, a covered porch running the length of the front, the roof already collecting an inch of snow along its pitch. The lamplight she had seen from below was warmer up close, amber pressing through glass that had been wiped clear on the inside. Someone was keeping vigil. The light had the quality of waiting. Judith climbed the porch steps and knocked. Before we find out who answers and how, if this story is moving something in you, subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. Now, back to Iron Ridge. The door opened after a long moment, and the man who filled the frame was exactly what the stories had promised, and somehow still a shock to witness directly. Edward Hawthorne was tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly under the doorframe's lintel, broad through the chest and shoulder in the way of men who have never had to cultivate it, who are simply built by the life they live. He was not wearing a shirt. She registered this with the same flat practicality with which she registered all information, and there was blood on his forearm, dried and dark, the kind that comes from hours of helpless hovering near something you cannot fix. His eyes were gray, and they moved over her with the swift, assessing coldness of a man who has been making rapid judgments his entire life. What she saw in them in the half-second before his expression hardened into something deliberate was not arrogance. It was exhaustion so profound that it had hollowed him out behind the eyes. Then the expression arrived, and it was everything the town had described. "No," he said. Judith kept her hand on the strap of the satchel. "You haven't heard what I'm offering." "I don't need to." His gaze moved over her with the same impersonal efficiency he had no doubt applied to every woman who had answered his notice, and she recognized the calculation for what it was. He was looking for strength and had already decided she didn't have any, which told her more about the poverty of his imagination than anything else. "The trial is closed. Go back down the mountain before the road goes entirely." Judith did not move. "I'm not here about your notice," she said. "I'm here about your mother." Something crossed his face, gone before she could name it. "The doctor has already—" "The doctor," Judith said, quietly but with a precision that cut cleanly through his sentence, "has never seen what's in this satchel, and he's never seen a wound like your mother's survive the night." She held his gaze. The snow fell between them, soft and indifferent. Somewhere above them, behind one of those amber windows, Esther Hawthorne was breathing her difficult, rattling breaths into the dark. Edward's jaw tightened. He did not move aside, but he did not close the door. The silence between them lasted long enough that the snow began to settle on Judith's shoulders. She did not brush it off. She had learned over the course of a life spent being evaluated and found wanting that stillness was its own argument, that the person who moved first in a silence like this one was the person who had already begun to lose. So she stood, and she waited, and she let Edward Hawthorne look at her for as long as he needed to see whatever it was he was capable of seeing. Above them, a sound moved through the ceiling, faint, liquid, wrong. The sound of lungs working harder than lungs should have to work. Edward stepped back from the door. He did not say, "Come in." He did not say anything at all, but the space where his body had been was now open, and the warmth of the house pressed outward into the cold, and Judith understood this for the concession it was. She stepped across the threshold without ceremony and set the satchel down on the entry bench to unbuckle her snow-caked coat. The doctor said she needed rest and warmth, Edward said from somewhere behind her. His voice had shifted. Still hard, but the hardness now had a desperate quality underneath it, the way frozen ground sounds when something below it is moving. He said the wound was beyond treating, that keeping her comfortable was the only... "What color is it?" He stopped. "The wound," Judith said, turning to face him. "What color is the skin around it?" A muscle worked in his jaw. Dark, purple at the edges, black in the center. Judith nodded once, the way her grandmother used to nod when a diagnosis confirmed itself, not with satisfaction, but with the grim efficiency of a woman moving to the next necessary thing. "How long since it changed from red?" 3 days. "And the smell?" Something moved across his face that she recognized not as disgust, but as grief, the particular grief of a person who has been sitting with an unbearable thing long enough that naming it aloud still has the power to undo them. He looked away. "Yes." "Then we don't have the night to debate this," Judith said. She picked up the satchel. "Show me the room." He showed her. The staircase was narrow and steep, the walls bare timber, and he went ahead of her with a candle that threw his shadow large and unsteady against the wood. She noticed that he took the steps quietly, out of habit, the way people move in houses where someone is sleeping badly, and every sound is a small cruelty. She noticed the candle had burned low. He had been up here for hours, probably, sitting outside that door, doing the only thing left available to him, which was witness. The upper room itself was small and fiercely warm, a cast-iron stove in the corner burning high, furs piled on the narrow bed with a generosity that verged on frantic. And in the center of all that warmth, diminished by it somehow, lay Esther Hawthorne. She was smaller than Judith had expected. Memory had preserved her as a larger presence, a woman who had moved through Iron Ridge with the quiet authority of someone comfortable in her own consequence. But illness had been doing its work. Her white hair spread thin against the pillow. Her hands folded at her sides were the hands of someone who had stopped reaching for things. But her chest was still moving, shallow, labored, irregular, but moving. Judith set the satchel on the table beside the bed and opened it without haste. She unstoppered the tin of pine resin tallow, unwrapped the black cohosh, and set the wax paper parcel of root fire at the top of the order of things, where she could reach it when the time came. She became aware that Edward had not left the doorway. "I'll need clean water," she said without turning, "boiling, and cloth, linen if you have it, cotton if you don't. And then I'll need you to do something that will be very difficult for you." He heard him exhale. "What?" "Wait," she said, "and trust me." He brought the water without argument, which surprised her. She had expected resistance, another volley of cold assessment, perhaps a more articulate version of the dismissal he had offered at the door. Instead, he disappeared downstairs, and she heard the clank of the iron pot, the creak of the pump, the particular focused efficiency of a man who had been given a task and was grateful, in the way that drowning people are grateful for something solid to grip, to finally have one. She used the time well. By the time he returned with the pot and a folded stack of linen that had clearly been laundered and put away with military precision, Judith had turned back the furs, examined the wound by candlelight, and understood exactly what she was dealing with. The infection was deep, not surface corruption, but something that had tracked inward along the tissue, following the path of least resistance the way all destructive things do. The edges were the purple-black Edward had described, tight and shining with the particular pressure of fluid that had nowhere to go. The smell was faint but unambiguous. She had been in time. Barely. She worked without speaking for a while, and he stayed, standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, watching with the coiled and helpless tension of a man who had no instrument for this situation. He was accustomed to problems that yielded to force or will or sheer physical endurance. He did not know what to do with a problem that required him to stand still and watch a woman he had insulted 40 minutes ago try to save his mother's life. Judith could feel his eyes on her. She was accustomed to being looked at, though rarely like this, not with the flat appraisal of the marketplace, but with something raw and more conflicted. She chose to find it irrelevant. Esther's breathing was the only thing in the room that mattered. She began the first stage of the treatment, the warm compress of black cohosh and yarrow packed against the wound's perimeter to draw blood flow and begin softening the corruption at the edges. It would take time. Everything real took time. Her grandmother had taught her that the worst thing a healer could do was hurry the body, which had its own clock and did not negotiate. "She spoke this afternoon," Edward said. His voice came from a different place than before, quieter, stripped of its defensive architecture. "For about 10 minutes. She asked for water. She asked if the horses were fed." "That's her. That's still very much her." A pause. "She didn't ask for a doctor." "No," I agreed. "I expect she knew what a doctor would say." She heard him shift his weight. "She asked for you." Judith's hands stilled for just a moment. Then she continued. "What did she say, exactly?" "She said..." He stopped, cleared his throat with the awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to reporting tenderness. "She said, 'The Crane girl knows the old ways. Someone should go down and fetch the Crane girl.' I didn't..." Another pause, longer. "I didn't know who she meant, not at first." Judith thought about a lavender handkerchief, about a woman who had pressed it into a weeping child's hand, without making a performance of the kindness, without requiring anything in return, without even, as far as Judith had ever been able to tell, remembering it afterward as anything remarkable. The kind of goodness that doesn't know it's goodness because it isn't doing it for the accounting. "She remembered me," Judith said. It came out quieter than she intended. "She remembered everyone worth remembering," Edward said, and for the first time since she had stepped through his door, there was nothing in his voice but the plain, unguarded truth of a son who was terrified of losing his mother and had run out of ways to hide it. Judith looked up at him across the bed. In the low firelight, the fearsome beast of Iron Ridge looked exactly like what he was, a man sitting at the edge of a loss he had no idea how to survive. "Then let's make sure she has the chance to go on remembering. Hand me the root fire. It's time." He handed her the parcel without hesitation, which told her something had shifted in him that neither of them had yet named. The root fire compound was dark and dense, the color of old bark, with a smell that hit the back of the throat like wood smoke and something mineral beneath it, iron almost, and something sweeter underneath that, faintly medicinal, the way certain forest floors smell after rain. Her grandmother had rendered it from a combination of ingredients she had never written down in full, trusting instead that the knowledge would pass hand to hand the way it always had, woman to woman, generation to generation, through the simple and radical act of being present when it mattered. Judith unwrapped it carefully and set it on the linen cloth Edward had brought. "I need you to understand what's about to happen," she said, not looking up. "This will draw the infection out through the tissue. It will look worse before it looks better. There will be fluid, there will be a smell, and she may wake, and if she wakes, she may be in pain, and I need you to hold her still without panicking, because if she moves at the wrong moment, we lose everything we've gained." A silence. "I won't panic," he said. "Most people say that," Judith replied evenly, "and then the moment arrives and they discover they were wrong." She looked at him then, directly and without apology. "I'm not questioning your courage. I'm asking you to prepare for something specific. There is a difference." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, not offense this time, but the effortful and unfamiliar process of a man revising an assessment in real time. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do." So she told him. He listened the way she imagined he listened to everything that mattered, completely, without interruption, his eyes fixed on her face as if the instructions were being written somewhere he intended to keep them. When she finished, he asked one question, a practical one about the angle of his grip, and she answered it, and then they both turned to Esther and began. The next 40 minutes were the longest Judith had spent in a sick room since the night she had sat with her own mother, and she had believed for years that nothing would approach that particular quality of duration again. She had been wrong. This was different in character, but equal in weight. The compressed, airless time of a crisis that requires everything you have and does not care what it costs you. She applied the root fire in careful increments, packing it precisely against the wound's interior edge the way her grandmother had shown her, working from the outside margin inward, giving the compound time to penetrate before advancing. The smell intensified almost immediately, the corruption being drawn toward the surface, and she heard Edward's breathing change, controlled, deliberate, a man actively managing his own reactions by force of will. But he did not step back, and he did not look away. Esther stirred at the 12-minute mark. Her eyes opened halfway, clouded with fever, and a sound came out of her that was not quite a word, but carried the shape of protest in it, the body's instinctive resistance to pain. "Hold her," she said. Edward was already there, both hands steady and immovable on his mother's shoulders, his face close to hers, speaking to her in a low, continuous voice that Judith had realized after a moment she had never expected to hear from him. Not commanding, not managing, simply talking to his mother, the way a man talks when he has forgotten there is anyone else in the room, telling her she was safe, telling her he had her, telling her once in a voice so stripped of everything else that it was barely sound at all, that she was not allowed to leave him yet. Esther's body gradually stilled beneath his hands. Judith worked on. At the 38th minute, the wound changed. The pressure released. She felt it through the cloth, the almost imperceptible yield of tissue that had finally surrendered what it was holding, and the quality of the smell shifted from corruption to something rawer and cleaner underneath. She sat back on her heels and exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. "It's moving," she said quietly. "The infection is moving out." Edward looked up from his mother's face. His eyes, when they found Judith's, held something she had not seen in them before and did not yet have a name for. "Tell me what to do next," he said.
"Keep the compress warm," she told him. "Rotate it every 20 minutes. If the skin around the wound begins to lighten from purple toward red, even a little, that's the blood returning. That's what we want." He nodded and took her place at the bedside with a care that was almost ceremonial, as though the act of being trusted with this specific task had conferred on him a responsibility he intended to honor precisely. Judith watched him settle the compress and found herself recalibrating something she had assumed fixed. She moved to the chair in the corner, a plain wooden thing, the kind made for utility rather than comfort, and allowed herself, for the first time since she had ridden out of Iron Ridge, to stop moving. The stillness hit her all at once, the way exhaustion always waits politely until you sit down to make itself known. Her back ached from the ride. Her hands were stiff with cold that hadn't fully left them. Outside the window, the blizzard had reached its full expression, the wind finding the gaps in the timber and making its presence known in long, low registers that moved through the walls like something alive. She had been sitting for perhaps 10 minutes when Edward spoke. "You're cold." It was not a question. She had not been aware of shivering, but apparently she was. "I'm fine," she said, which was mostly true. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating the ethics of a situation he had not anticipated being in. Then he crossed to the hook beside the door and took down a flannel shirt, heavy, dark, worn to a softness that spoke of years of use, and held it out to her without a word. Judith looked at it. Then she took it, because she was practical above all things, and she was cold, and pride was a luxury that belonged to people who had more options than she did. She pulled it around her shoulders. It was warm, and it smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and it was large enough to wrap twice around her, which she did not comment on, and neither did he. "Thank you," she said. He returned to the bedside, rotated the compress, checked his mother's breathing. Then, in the way of people who have been alone with a large silence long enough that speech becomes its own kind of necessity, he said, "How did you learn it, the medicine?" "My grandmother, May Crane." She looked at him. "You knew her?" "My mother did." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on Esther's face. She spoke of her, said she was the most capable woman she had ever met, and that Iron Ridge didn't deserve her. A pause. "She said the same of you once. I didn't know who she meant then either." Judith absorbed this in silence. There was something both tender and painful in the information. The idea that Esther had been saying her name in this house, in this room, while Judith had been invisible in the valley below, moving through her narrow and sufficient life without knowing she existed in anyone's story but her own. "She was the only person," she said, and then stopped. "Who what?" She looked at the window, at the white darkness pressing against the glass. "Whoever looked at me and didn't see a liability." The words came out with less armor than she intended. She considered retracting them, and then decided she was too tired for the effort. Most people, they look and they calculate, and the calculation always comes out the same way. Too much of this, not enough of that. She paused. "Your notice said as much." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it, heavier and more honest. "The notice," Edward said slowly, "was written by a man who thought he understood what strength looked like." He did not look at her when he said it. His jaw was tight, the way it gets when a person is working against their own nature to say something true. "I'm beginning to think he was looking at the wrong things entirely." Judith said nothing, but something in her chest, long braced against exactly this kind of moment, shifted very slightly toward warmth. The fire burned low sometime after midnight, and Edward rose to feed it without being asked. Judith watched him move through the room, quiet for a man his size. She had noticed this earlier and noticed it again now, the way he navigated the space around his mother's bed with an awareness of every creak and shift, the body knowledge of someone who had been keeping this vigil long enough that it had become its own kind of fluency. He set 2 heavy logs on the grate and remained crouching before the stove for a moment, watching the flame take hold, his forearms resting on his knees. "Why did you come?" he asked. Not the way he had said things earlier in the evening, not with the flat challenge of a man defending his threshold, but with the genuine bewilderment of someone who has been turning a question over for hours and finally decided to simply ask it. Judith considered the answer, the real one, not the practical one. "Do you remember the winter of 1870?" she said. He turned his head slightly. "I remember it was bad. I was 12. My mother had just died." She kept her voice even.
the way she kept most things, contained, functional, not inviting pity, which she had never found useful. I was sitting on the steps of the general store because I didn't know where else to go. I hadn't eaten since the morning before. I was wearing my mother's coat, which was too large, and I was crying, which I was trying not to do because people were walking past, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing it. Edward had turned fully toward her now. The firelight was behind him, and his face was in shadow, but she could feel the quality of his attention. "Your mother came out of Hess's," Judith continued. "She had a peppermint stick and a lavender handkerchief. She sat down next to me on those steps, in her good coat, in the cold, without being asked, and she didn't say anything for a while. She just sat there. And then she pressed both things into my hands, and she said, 'You are more than they see,' and then she went back inside." The room was very quiet. Outside, the blizzard had begun its long retreat, the wind dropping from a howl to something more resigned, the snow falling now in the heavy, peaceful silence of a storm spending its last energy. "She probably didn't remember it the next day," Judith said. "People like your mother, the goodness is so constant it doesn't register as individual moments. It's just the way they move through the world." She paused. "But I remembered it every day for 15 years. Every day I was mocked in the market. Every day someone looked through me like I was a window. I remembered that someone had seen me once, and I held on to it, and it kept something alive in me that might otherwise have gone out." She stopped. The fire snapped and resettled. "So when I heard she was dying, and I knew I had something that might help, there was never a question. There was never a calculation. You don't weigh a debt like that against a blizzard and come out on the side of staying home by the fire." Edward was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had the roughness of a man handling something fragile and unaccustomed to the task. "I tried to turn you away," he said. "I stood in that doorway and I looked at you and I made the same calculation everyone else has always made." "Yes," Judith said simply, "you did." "I was wrong." "Yes," she said again, "you were." He absorbed this without flinching, which she respected. A lesser man would have qualified it, or explained it, or turned it into a story about himself that was more comfortable to inhabit. Edward simply sat with the fact of it, the way she imagined he sat with all difficult truths, not enjoying it, but not running from it either. "The notice," he said after a moment. "Every woman I turned away. I told myself I was being practical." He looked at his hands. "I was being afraid." "Of what?" He looked at his mother. "Of choosing wrong. Of bringing someone into this life who couldn't sustain it and losing her the way—" He stopped. "My father died in a January storm, trying to reach a neighbor. The cold took him in under an hour." His jaw tightened. "I told myself I needed someone strong. What I meant was I needed someone I couldn't lose." Judith looked at him across the room, this large, armored, frightened man who had built his loneliness into a philosophy and called it standards, and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite tenderness, but lived in the same territory as both. "Heavy logs burn longest," she said quietly. He looked at her. "My grandmother used to say it about people." Judith pulled his flannel shirt a little closer around her shoulders. "The ones who look like too much, who take up space, who the world keeps trying to cut down to a manageable size." She met his eyes steadily. "We burn longest, Edward. We last the winter. That's not a liability. That's the whole point of us." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, the last of the defensive architecture, the final outpost of the carefully maintained distance, came quietly down. Neither of them said anything after that, but the silence, for the first time since she had stepped through his door, was not a space between adversaries. It was something warmer and more tentative, and neither of them moved to disturb it. At the bedside, Esther breathed on, slowly, laboriously, but with a steadiness that had not been there before. The compression did its ancient, patient work. The fire held. They watched and waited, and the long night continued its turning toward dawn.
The dawn came the way dawns do after hard nights, not dramatically, but with a slow and accumulating insistence, gray light pressing through the snow-crusted window glass until the candlelight became redundant and the room resolved itself into something that belonged to the living world again, rather than the suspended, breathless country of the vigil. Judith had not slept. She did not think Edward had either, though at some point in the small hours he had moved from the chair to the floor beside the bed, his back against the frame, his head tipped back, eyes closed in the posture of a man who had given his body permission to rest without surrendering his post. She had let him be. She had spent the last hours of darkness monitoring Esther's temperature with the back of her hand against the older woman's forehead, rotating the compress as she had instructed Edward to do, watching the wound with the patient, empirical attention her grandmother had taught her, the slow retreat of the purple-black from the skin's margin, the tentative return of something that was not yet healthy color but was moving in that direction, the way the tissue had lost its terrible tautness and begun incrementally to release. At 10 minutes past 6, she pressed her hand to Esther's forehead and felt it. The fever had broken. Not gone entirely, that would take days and rest and broth and time. But the raging, consuming heat that had been burning through the old woman for 4 days had crested and turned, the body having finally won the argument it had been making against the infection all along. Esther's skin was damp, cool at the temples, and her breathing, still slow, still effortful, had lost its rattling, desperate quality and settled into something that sounded for the first time like genuine sleep rather than unconsciousness. Judith exhaled. She became aware that Edward was awake. She didn't hear him move, he was too quiet for that, but she felt the shift in the room's attention, the way you feel someone's eyes before you see them. She turned. He was standing, arms at his sides, looking at his mother's face, looking at the color beginning its long return to Esther's cheeks. His throat moved. "The fever broke," Judith said. He nodded once, very slowly, the nod of a man receiving information his body already knew and needed a moment to process properly. He pressed the back of his own hand to his mother's forehead, a mirror of what Judith had just done, as though he needed the physical confirmation, the direct and unmistakable evidence of his own skin. Then he stood up straight and put his face in his hands for just a moment, 10 seconds, perhaps 15, and Judith looked at the window and gave him those seconds without comment, because some things are not meant to be witnessed directly, only honored by the decent act of looking away. When she looked back, his hands were at his sides again. His eyes were red at the rims. His expression was not embarrassed, which told her more about his character than anything else the night had revealed. "She'll need watching for the next 3 days," Judith said, returning to the practical because the practical was where she was most fluent and because he needed something to hold. "The wound will need redressing twice daily. I can write down that—" "Stay." The word came out without preamble, without the defensive wrapping he had put around everything else he had said to her. Just the word, plain and direct, the way he had been learning to speak across the course of the night. Judith looked at him. "Not to work," he said, and something in his voice was careful now in a different way than before. Not the carefulness of a man managing his distance, but the carefulness of a man who has something to lose and knows it. He held her gaze. "This house has been missing something it didn't have a name for, and I think you know what I mean, and I think you've known since the moment you rode through that gate." Judith stood very still. She thought about the bakery, the dawn dark and the flour, and the invisible arithmetic of a life built around being useful to people who did not see her. She thought about the narrow bed above the tanner's shop and the satchel underneath it, and the 15 years of mornings she had pressed a lavender handkerchief between her palms like a prayer before going out to face the day. She looked around the room,
at the cast iron stove, at the timber walls, at the window now filling with the pale gold of a winter morning breaking clean and cold over the ridge, at the woman in the bed who once sat down beside a weeping child on a cold step and made her feel for one brief moment as though the world had miscounted her, at the man standing across from her who had spent a night dismantling everything he thought he knew and arrived at dawn with his hands empty and open. "I'll need my own room." Something moved through Edward's face that began as relief and arrived cautiously as something warmer. "You can have whichever one you want. And I'll continue the baking orders until Hess finds someone. I won't leave him without notice. That's not negotiable." "Understood. And you'll speak to me the way you spoke to me last night, not the way you spoke to me at the door." He held her gaze steadily. "That man at the door," he said, "made a great number of errors in judgment that I intend to spend considerable time correcting." A pause, and then with the particular awkwardness of a man attempting sincerity in a register he has not often used, beginning, if you'll allow it, with an apology. Judith looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Esther, who slept on in her clean and healing quiet, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone who had decided, without consulting anyone, to remain among the living. Then Judith looked back at the window, at the ridge beyond it, blazing now in the full, cold light of morning, the snow unbroken and vast and extraordinarily beautiful, the kind of landscape that does not accommodate smallness or apology or the cramped arithmetic of a life lived at the world's margins. She had ridden up this mountain in a blizzard with a satchel full of her grandmother's medicine and 15 years of quiet, accumulated purpose. She had walked through a door that was closed against her. She had worked through the longest night, and the fever had broken, and the dawn had come, and the ridge was hers as much as anyone's, more than most, perhaps, because she had earned her view of it in a way that silk and softness never could. The queen does not always arrive in a carriage. Sometimes she arrives on a draft horse in a blizzard, smelling of pine resin and root fire, with flour still worked into the lines of her hands. But she arrives. "I'll stay," said Judith Crane, and Iron Ridge, though it did not yet know it, had just met its Lady of the Ridge. If this story moved something in you, if you rode through that blizzard with Judith, if you sat through that long night beside the fire, then this community is exactly where you belong. Subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Like this one if Judith earned it. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the world has been miscounting them because they exist and they are more than they see. And drop a comment telling us what Judith means to you, or simply where in the world you're reading from tonight. We read every single one. The ridge is wide enough for all of us.